I swear, if I had known what was coming, I never would have taken that road. It was supposed to be a fun Halloween night, me and Julia, dressed up and ready for a party. We were excited, laughing in the car, playing music and cracking jokes about who had the better costume. I was Batman, and Julia was a vampire. Typical, right? But we were just having fun. The plan was simple. We'd take a shortcut, a little detour through some back roads to avoid traffic and get to the party faster. The GPS said it would save us at least 20 minutes, so why not? I mean, who wouldn't? The night was cold, foggy, but hey, it's Halloween. Fog just makes everything better. Or at least it should have. As soon as we turned onto that road, though, things felt off. The trees lining the road were too close, too dark, their branches reaching over us like twisted fingers. The fog started thickening, swallowing the headlights, and making everything beyond the car feel distant, like we were driving into a black hole. I should have noticed it then, but I was too caught up in the vibe of the night. Julia even said something like, "This place is a little creepy, don't you think?" But I just shrugged it off, said something stupid like, "It's Halloween, it's supposed to be creepy." That's when things got weird. The first thing I noticed was the streetlights. They just vanished. I'm not talking about one or two lights flickering out. No, I mean they vanished. 1 second they were there, lighting up the fog behind us, and the next, nothing. Like the road behind us had been swallowed by the night. I checked the rearview mirror, and I swear, the road just stopped existing. There was nothing back there. No lights, no trees, no road. Just blackness, as if we had crossed into some kind of void. I laughed nervously, trying to play it cool, but Julia wasn't having it. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaky, like she didn't even want to hear the answer. I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter, feeling the sweat forming on my palms. We kept driving, and the road kept stretching out ahead of us, but every time I glanced in the mirror, more of it was gone. It was as if we were being erased, piece by piece, from wherever the hell we came from. My heart started racing. I tried turning back, thinking maybe I could reverse out of whatever nightmare we'd driven into, but when I spun the wheel and looked behind us, there was nothing. Just darkness, a void that ate up everything in its path. The road was gone. I tried to laugh it off again, but Julia was pale, her eyes wide, staring straight ahead. "We need to turn around," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't keep going." But the thing is, there was no turning back. There was no going back at all. We were trapped. That's when it hit me. We weren't just lost. We were being followed by something, or worse, by nothing. Something that wanted us to keep driving. Something that didn't want us to stop. And the farther we went, the more I knew we were never getting out. I can scarcely explain the fear that gripped my chest as we drove further into that endless night. It was as if the world around us had ceased to exist, swallowed whole by an abyss too vast and too hungry to comprehend. The road ahead, once clear and promising, stretched on like a cruel joke, a path with no destination, a journey with no hope of return. And yet, we continued. What choice did we have? The silence in the car was suffocating. Julia, usually the one to fill the quiet with idle chatter, sat frozen beside me, her pale hands gripping her seat as if clinging to the last vestiges of reality. Her breath, shallow and quick, mirrored the frantic beating of my own heart. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat, strangled by a fear I couldn't yet name. As I looked out the window, I saw that the trees lining the road had grown taller, their gnarled branches twisting together overhead like the bony fingers of some malevolent force. They blocked out the moon, the stars, any sign of the world we had left behind. The fog, thick and oppressive, curled around the car like a living thing, smothering the light from our headlights until it barely penetrated the thick wall of mist ahead. And behind us, nothing. Absolutely nothing. I glanced into the rearview mirror again, hoping, praying to see even the faintest trace of the road we had taken. But there was only an impenetrable darkness, creeping ever closer, as if the very fabric of the world was unraveling behind us, erasing any hope of escape. My pulse quickened and a cold sweat beaded on my forehead. "We can't keep going," Julia whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the hum of the engine. "We need to stop. Please, we need to stop." I knew she was right. Every instinct I had screamed that we were driving into something we couldn't outrun. But stopping? That felt like surrendering ourselves to whatever lay hidden in that void, waiting for us to make one wrong move. "I don't think we can," I murmured, my voice hollow, echoing in the confined space of the car. "There's nothing behind us, Jules. No way back. And ahead, I don't know." Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, filling the silence with a distorted hiss. My fingers fumbled for the knob, twisting it in desperation, but the static only grew louder. Beneath it, barely discernible, was something else. A low, droning hum, like the faint whispers of 1,000 unseen voices calling from just beyond the edge of reality. Julia's eyes widened in horror as the sound grew louder, filling the car with its eerie cadence. She covered her ears, shaking her head as if trying to block out the voices that weren't meant for us. "Make it stop!" she cried, her voice a high-pitched wail of panic. "Please make it stop!" I punched the radio, silencing it with a sharp crack, but the damage was done. The air in the car felt colder, heavier, as if those unseen whispers had left their mark on us. I could feel them, watching, waiting, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows that pressed in on us from all sides. "Something's out there," Julia muttered, her voice low, almost inaudible. "I can feel it. They're waiting for us." Her words chilled me to the core because I felt it too. We were no longer alone on that road. Someone was watching. There are moments, fleeting and treacherous, when the mind teeters on the edge of reason, when the boundaries between what is real and what is imagined blur like shadows on the periphery of sight. That night, as the fog thickened into a pale shroud, I felt that line dissolving, crumbling under the weight of a fear so profound it gnawed at the very marrow of my bones. The road before us had grown narrower, as though the world itself was closing in around us, suffocating us with its emptiness. The trees, dark and towering, seemed to bend toward the car, their twisted branches reaching out like spectral hands. Each mile felt like an eternity, yet there was no end in sight, only the unrelenting blackness that swallowed our path, leaving us to drift in an ocean of silence and dread. Julia hadn't spoken since the radio's sinister outburst, but I could feel her beside me, trembling, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Her eyes were wide, glazed with terror, fixed on something just beyond the windshield. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing, only the fog, thick and impenetrable, wrapping itself around us like a deathly veil. And yet, I felt it too. We were not alone. There in the mist, at first just a flicker, a shadow out of place, something moved. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A figure just beyond the reach of our headlights, slinking between the trees. I blinked, my heart pounding, but when I looked again, it was gone. I clenched the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as though speaking any louder might summon whatever lingered in the darkness. Julia didn't answer. She was still staring, unblinking, her lips parted in a silent scream. I reached out, placing a trembling hand on her arm, but she recoiled as if my touch burned her. "Julia?" I repeated, my voice more insistent now, but she only shook her head, her gaze still fixed on that void ahead. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A pale shape flitting through the fog, closer this time. My breath hitched in my throat as the figure took form, indistinct but human-like, its movements jerky, unnatural, as though it were struggling to maintain its shape in the world of the living. A cold dread settled over me, deeper than any fear I had ever known. It was not just the sight of the thing, It was the sense that it was aware of us, that it had been watching all along, and now it had decided to show itself. And with that realization came another. It was not alone. The fog around us seemed to ripple, shifting in unnatural ways, and I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, moving silently through the mist surrounding the car. Their forms were faint, barely distinguishable from the vapor that cloaked them, but I could feel their presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing in on us from all sides. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rapid thudding of my heart in my chest. My breath came in shallow gasps, my hands shaking violently as I gripped the wheel. What do we do?" Julia finally whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. She had finally torn her gaze from the fog, her eyes wild and frantic as they met mine. But I had no answer. The road ahead was swallowed in darkness, and behind us the world had vanished. There was nowhere to go, no way out. We were trapped, and they were coming. I reached for the gear shift, desperate to move, to do anything that might put distance between us and those things, those watchers. But the engine sputtered, then died with a low, agonizing groan. The lights flickered, and for one terrifying moment, we were plunged into total darkness. And in that darkness, I heard it. A sound that still haunts me to this day. A low, whispering hiss, like the rustle of dead leaves in the wind, coming from all around us. It was them. They were speaking, and they were getting closer. There is a peculiar horror that comes not with the sight of terror, but with the sound of it. The unseen, the unknown. The whispers that now filled the car, curling around us in the thick, suffocating air, were such a sound. They seeped through the thin walls of reality into our bones, chilling our very souls. My heart thudded violently in my chest, each beat like the ticking of some infernal clock counting down our demise. I turned the key again, my hands slick with sweat, praying that the engine would roar to life, but it remained silent, dead as the void that pressed in on us. The darkness outside the windows had thickened into something almost solid, and the pale figures that had been drifting in the fog were now unmistakable. They were closer now, so much closer, hovering just beyond the glass like silent sentinels of doom. The whispers continued, rising and falling in waves, like a macabre chant carried on a breeze I could not feel. They spoke in tongues I could not understand, but the intent behind them was clear. Malice, deep and ancient, cold and relentless. My skin prickled as the voices pressed against my mind, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I could feel them worming their way into my thoughts, twisting them, darkening them. "Can you hear them?" Julia whispered beside me, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide with terror, her pupils dilated as she stared out into the void, fixated on the shifting forms that surrounded us. "I hear them," I replied, my voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. A multitude of voices, each more insidious than the last. It felt as though they were reaching out, their invisible fingers brushing against the edges of our consciousness, beckoning us to join them in the darkness. A sudden tapping at the window made us both jump. I snapped my head to the side, and for the briefest moment, I saw a face. Pale, gaunt, its eyes sunken and hollow, staring at me with a hunger that sent ice through my veins. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the fog, but the image remained burned into my mind. "Drive," Julia pleaded, her voice shrill with panic. "Please, we have to get out of here." "I'm trying," I muttered, my hands trembling as I twisted the key in the ignition again, willing the engine to start. The car groaned, the headlights flickering weakly, but it did not move. We were stranded, helpless, with no way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread washing over me. They were no longer just outside, they were inside the car now, filling the air, closing in on us. I could feel their presence, pressing against my skin, suffocating me. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my chest tightening with each passing second. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of them was inside the car. At first, it was just a shadow, barely discernible in the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. A tall, thin silhouette, seated in the back seat, its head bowed, its hands resting in its lap. I could see no face, only the vague outline of its form, but the weight of its presence was undeniable. It sat unnaturally still, as though waiting for something. Or someone. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare look away from the mirror, but my heart hammered in my chest as I whispered to Julia, "Don't turn around." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment there was only silence between us, save for the ever-present whispers. Slowly, painfully, her eyes met mine, and I saw the horror there, the understanding that something unspeakable was with us. "We're not alone," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. Julia's lip quivered as she fought to contain her terror, her body rigid with fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know. The darkness had swallowed us whole, the whispers beckoning us deeper into its grasp. And now, the watcher in the back seat sat silently, waiting for the inevitable. "Can you hear them?" Julia whispered beside me, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide with terror, her pupils dilated as she stared out into the void, fixated on the shifting forms that surrounded us. "I hear them," I replied, my voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. A multitude of voices, each more insidious than the last. It felt as though they were reaching out, their invisible fingers brushing against the edges of our consciousness, beckoning us to join them in the darkness. A sudden tapping at the window made us both jump. I snapped my head to the side, and for the briefest moment I saw a face, pale, gaunt, its eyes sunken and hollow, staring at me with a hunger that sent ice through my veins. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the fog, but the image remained burned into my mind. "Drive," Julia pleaded, her voice shrill with panic. "Please, we have to get out of here." "I'm trying," I muttered, my hands trembling as I twisted the key in the ignition again, willing the engine to start. The car groaned, the headlights flickering weakly, but it did not move. We were stranded, helpless, with no way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread washing over me. They were no longer just outside, they were inside the car now, filling the air, closing in on us. I could feel their presence, pressing against my skin, suffocating me. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my chest tightening with each passing second. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of them was inside the car. At first, it was just a shadow, barely discernible in the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. A tall, thin silhouette, seated in the back seat, its head bowed, its hands resting in its lap. I could see no face, only the vague outline of its form, but the weight of its presence was undeniable. It sat unnaturally still, as though waiting for something. Or someone. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare look away from the mirror, but my heart hammered in my chest as I whispered to Julia, "Don't turn around." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, there was only silence between us, save for the ever-present whispers. Slowly, painfully, her eyes met mine, and I saw the horror there, the understanding that something unspeakable was with us. "We're not alone," I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. Julia's lip quivered as she fought to contain her terror, her body rigid with fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know. The darkness had swallowed us whole, the whispers beckoning us deeper into its grasp. And now, the watcher in the back seat sat silently, waiting for the inevitable. The road behind us was gone, and the road ahead? Only more darkness. There was no escape. The whispers surged louder, their terrible chorus filling my ears, and I realized with growing horror that they were speaking to me. It is in the face of terror that one's mind begins to unravel, losing its delicate grip on reality. As I sat there, frozen, my breath ragged, I felt that familiar tether fray and splinter within me. He was still there, the figure in the back seat, cloaked in shadow, his presence undeniable. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn around, to confront it, to see it with my own eyes. And yet, an even greater terror held me still. I knew that once I looked, there would be no unseeing, no return from the depths into which my soul would surely plunge. The whispers that had once filled the air with their eerie dissonance now seemed to focus, their insidious voices sharpening, all directing toward me. They whispered my name, softly at first, as though testing the boundaries of my will, but then with growing insistence, growing malice. My name, uttered from the lips of the unseen. My name called from the abyss that threatened to consume us both. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles aching, my heart a prisoner in my chest. Julia had gone silent beside me. I dared not look at her now. I could feel the weight of her fear, palpable in the suffocating space between us, as though it too had taken form in the darkness. The car felt smaller, the air heavier. Every breath I drew felt tainted with some unseen malignancy. And then, with a cold certainty, I realized something far more horrifying than the watcher behind me. The whispers were coming from inside the car. I don't know how I came to understand it, whether it was the shift in the air, or the way the sound reverberated off the walls, or perhaps it was the simple, dreadful fact that in such suffocating darkness, all horrors become clearer. But as they hissed my name, as the voices slithered through the gloom, I knew they were all around us. Not just one, not just the figure in the back seat, but many. Too many to count. There was no escape, no fleeing from this. The thought pierced through my terror like a cruel blade. They were not merely watching, they were with us. They had been waiting for us, biding their time, circling us like vultures until the moment was right. A tremor passed through my body as I fought the urge to scream. This was madness, pure and unrelenting. How had we come to this? One moment we had been driving along the road, the world still governed by rules I understood, and now we were prisoners in this infernal place, surrounded by shadows and whispers, trapped in a car that had become a tomb. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation, any thread of reason that could unravel this nightmare, but none came. Only the darkness answered, and within that darkness, the whispers grew louder still, swelling into a chorus of malevolent intent. The road behind us was gone, and the road ahead, only more darkness. There was no escape. The whispers surged louder, their terrible chorus filling my ears, and I realized with growing horror that they were speaking to me. It is in the face of terror that one's mind begins to unravel, losing its delicate grip on reality. As I sat there, frozen, my breath ragged, I felt that familiar tether fray and splinter within me. He was still there, the figure in the back seat, cloaked in shadow, his presence undeniable. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn around, to confront it, to see it with my own eyes, and yet an even greater terror held me still. I knew that once I looked, there would be no unseeing, no return from the depths into which my soul would surely plunge. The whispers that had once filled the air with their eerie dissonance now seemed to focus, their insidious voices sharpening, all directing toward me. They whispered my name, softly at first, as though testing the boundaries of my will, but then with growing insistence, growing malice. My name, uttered from the lips of the unseen. My name called from the abyss that threatened to consume us both. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles aching, my heart a prisoner in my chest. Julia had gone silent beside me. I dared not look at her now. I could feel the weight of her fear, palpable in the suffocating space between us, as though it, too, had taken form in the darkness. The car felt smaller, the air heavier. Every breath I drew felt tainted with some unseen malignancy. And then, with a cold certainty, I realized something far more horrifying than the watcher behind me. The whispers were coming from inside the car. I don't know how I came to understand it, whether it was the shift in the air, or the way the sound reverberated off the walls, or perhaps it was the simple, dreadful fact that in such suffocating darkness, all horrors become clearer. But as they hissed my name, as the voices slithered through the gloom, I knew they were all around us. Not just one, not just the figure in the back seat, but many. Too many to count. There was no escape, no fleeing from this. The thought pierced through my terror like a cruel blade. They were not merely watching, they were with us. They had been waiting for us, biding their time, circling us like vultures, until the moment was right. A tremor passed through my body as I fought the urge to scream. This was madness, pure and unrelenting. How had we come to this? One moment, we had been driving along the road, the world still governed by rules I understood. And now, we were prisoners in this infernal place, surrounded by shadows and whispers, trapped in a car that had become a tomb. My mind raced, grasping for any explanation, any thread of reason that could unravel this nightmare, but none came. Only the darkness answered, and within that darkness, the whispers grew louder still, swelling into a chorus of malevolent intent. And then Julia spoke. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was barely a whisper itself. "What do they want?" Her words hung in the air, trembling, as though even she feared to ask the question. I didn't know. How could I? But there was a strange sensation growing inside me, an awful sinking realization that whatever it was, it had been waiting for us all along. This road, this cursed path we had taken, had not been some mere accident. It had been a lure, a trap set in the blackness to draw us in. "I don't think they want us to leave," I managed, though my voice sounded distant, foreign, as if spoken by someone else entirely. The truth in those words gnawed at me, relentless. And then came the softest of sounds, the creak of leather, the slightest shift of weight behind me. My heart stilled. He moved. The watcher in the back seat, the figure that had remained so still, so quiet, now stirred. Slowly, deliberately. It was then that I realized the whispers had gone silent. The terrible hissing that had filled my ears for so long had ceased, leaving in its place a silence so profound it felt like the grave itself had opened its maw. In that silence I heard something far worse than any whisper. A breath. A low, rasping breath, close enough that I could feel the air shift behind me. It was no longer just a shadow. It was real. It was there, and it was breathing down my neck. I felt my muscles tighten, every nerve screaming for me to run, to flee. But there was nowhere to go. The car, the road, the world beyond, it had all vanished, swallowed by the darkness. And then, a voice, low, guttural, like the sound of earth being torn apart. "Look at me," it rasped, the words slicing through the silence like a dagger. I froze. The voice came from the back seat, from the thing that had been watching us all this time. "Look at me," it repeated, closer now, the air thick with its presence. Every instinct told me not to, but I could feel its will pressing down on me, forcing me, compelling me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to resist, but in that moment I knew there was no resisting. I had to look, and so, with a trembling breath, I turned. In the moment my eyes met the figure in the back seat, the world as I knew it crumbled into oblivion. It was not merely a shadow, nor a man cloaked in darkness. No, it was something far worse. It was emptiness incarnate, a figure that seemed to absorb all light, all hope, until only despair remained. Its face, if it could be called that, was a void. A featureless abyss that seemed to pulse and writhe, as if reality itself could not bear to define its existence. I stared into it, my breath caught in my throat, as a terror deeper than anything I had ever known took hold of me. It was the kind of fear that did not merely strike the heart, but one that devoured the soul. My body froze. every instinct of survival dulled by the sheer overwhelming presence of the thing before me. Its void-like face expanded, stretching the limits of perception, as though it were swallowing not only the space in the car, but my very thoughts. "Look deeper," it whispered, but the words weren't spoken aloud. They echoed inside my mind, reverberating through every corner of my consciousness. I felt myself being drawn in, pulled toward that unfathomable emptiness, helpless against its pull. My vision blurred as the world around me dissolved into blackness. And the whispers, those damned ceaseless whispers, returned, louder and more menacing than ever before. In the periphery of my vision, I saw Julia, rigid with terror. Her eyes were wide, pupils dark, locked on the same abyss that had ensnared me. She was trembling, her lips moving soundlessly, and I knew in that moment that whatever was happening to me, it was happening to her too. We were both being consumed. I tried to speak, to pull us both out of the nightmare, but the words failed me. My throat constricted, every sound choked back by the weight of the presence in the car. The thing? It was no longer just behind me, it was inside me, clawing at my mind, twisting my thoughts, filling my head with an unbearable cacophony. And then, it spoke again, its voice an unholy rasp in my mind. "This is where it ends. There is no return. You are ours now." My vision flickered. Flashes of memories, glimpses of moments long forgotten, all twisted and corrupted by the thing in the back seat. It showed me my own end, over and over, each vision more horrifying than the last. I saw myself standing at the edge of the road, staring into a pit of blackness as the world disappeared around me. I saw Julia screaming, her face distorted with fear, her body dissolving into the dark. I saw the road, the trees, the fog, all vanishing, as though they had never existed. It was all unraveling, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then, amidst the chaos, a thought broke through. A small, desperate shred of will, fighting to survive. I couldn't let this thing consume us. I couldn't let it win. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wrenched my eyes away from the abyss. The moment I did, the world snapped back into focus. The car, the road, the fog. It was still there, but the terror had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened, become more insidious. "We have to get out of here," I gasped, my voice hoarse, raw from the strain. "We can't stay here. It's playing with us. This road, this thing, we're not meant to leave." Julia didn't respond, her face still twisted in horror, but I could see the fight in her eyes. She was trying, just as I was, to escape the grip of the darkness. I turned the key again, praying, begging the car to start. The engine sputtered, groaned, and for a heartbeat I thought it would fail. But then, mercifully, it roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires screeching as we shot forward into the fog. But the road, the cursed road, it seemed endless, stretching out before us like a nightmare that had no end. The fog thickened, swirling around the car, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices rising in a deafening crescendo. I felt the presence in the back seat again, but I refused to look. I couldn't. I wouldn't. If I did, I knew it would be the end. "Faster," Julia whimpered, her voice barely audible over the roaring engine and the whispers. "Please, just go faster." I pressed the pedal to the floor, the car hurtling through the night at breakneck speed. But no matter how fast we went, the road ahead never shortened. It was as though we were driving in circles, trapped in some twisted loop of time and space. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog lifted. I blinked, disoriented, as the dense gray mist thinned, revealing the world beyond. The dark, endless road stretched out before us, but now there was something more. Lights, distant but real. The outline of a town, faint but unmistakable. "Do you see it?" I gasped, my heart pounding. "We're almost there." Julia nodded weakly, her hand gripping mine as we sped toward the lights. The whispers faded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I began to hope. Maybe, just maybe, we would make it out. But just as we neared the edge of the town, a voice, low and cold, filled with malice, whispered in my ear, We'll be waiting. And in the rearview mirror, I saw the darkness shift once more. The figure was still there, still watching. We had escaped, but we had not left it behind. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to write a story like this. I mean, I've always been skeptical about paranormal stuff. Ghosts, demons? Nah, not for me. But what happened to me last summer? It changed everything. I haven't been the same since. It started on a Saturday night. I was home alone, just like any other weekend. My wife was out of town visiting her parents, so I had the whole place to myself. The house was dead quiet, which was something I used to enjoy. I'd sit back, throw on a movie, and unwind. That night, though, something felt off. You know that feeling you get when someone's watching you, but there's no one around? Yeah, that. It was creeping up my spine, gnawing at me. Around 11 p.m. I heard a noise. At first I thought it was the wind. It had been picking up that night. But this wasn't just a gust. It was a soft knock, like someone tapping at the window. I froze. My living room window faces the backyard, and there's no reason anyone should be out there. I muted the TV and listened. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. But just as I was about to unmute, there it was again. This time louder. I swear, my heart stopped for a second. I didn't want to check. I didn't want to get up and look, but something inside me said I had to. So I slowly crept over to the window, trying not to make a sound. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the outline of someone standing just outside. I pulled the curtain back just a bit, and what I saw, it still makes my skin crawl. There was a man, or at least I think it was a man, standing motionless with his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide, too wide, staring straight ahead as if he could see me through the curtain. But here's the thing, his face, it wasn't right. His features were distorted, like a bad reflection in a funhouse mirror. His mouth was twisted into this unnatural grin, and his breath fogged up the glass in long, slow breaths. I stepped back, panic flooding my chest. What the hell was that? I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but as I turned back to the window, he was gone. Just vanished. I couldn't see anything out there, just the darkness of my yard and the trees swaying in the wind. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was a prank, maybe some kid messing around. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It felt too real, too sinister. I locked every door, every window, double-checked them all. But that feeling, that creeping, suffocating sense of dread, it never left. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every creak made my heart race. I was sure he was out there, watching, waiting. I kept thinking, what if he tries to get in? What if he's already inside? But the worst part? The next morning, I found something on the window. Fingerprints. Long, smudged streaks like someone had been dragging their fingers down the glass. From the inside. It is strange how the mind lingers upon the edge of madness when darkness falls. The sun had risen, casting away the terrors of the previous night, but I remained trapped and snared within the tightening grip of an unseen fear. My rationality, once steadfast, had begun to wither, crumbling under the weight of what I had witnessed, or rather, what I thought I had witnessed. That face. Those eyes, wide and unblinking, had burrowed into my soul like a parasite, feeding on my sanity. I could not shake the feeling that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. I paced the house, every step an echo of my growing unease. The morning light filtered through the windows, weak and pale, like a dying flame. It offered no comfort, only casting long, oppressive shadows upon the walls. The house, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a cage. Its every creak, its every groan, a whispered taunt. I could not escape the thought that I was being watched. Not by the man at the window, no. Something far more sinister lingered in the air, unseen but ever present. As though the very walls held their breath in anticipation of some dreadful revelation. The fingerprints, those wretched marks smeared upon the glass, haunted me. How could they have been there, upon the inside of the window? I had locked everything, sealed every point of entry, Yet there they were, evidence of an intruder who defied all logic. I ran my fingers along the streaks, cold sweat prickling my skin. The glass felt normal beneath my touch, smooth, unremarkable, and yet it bore the traces of something that should not have been. My hand trembled as I pulled away. I tried to reason with myself, clinging desperately to the idea that it was nothing more than a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. Perhaps the mind, when weary, conjures its own horrors, phantoms of the subconscious, emerging from the depths to torment the soul. But even as I entertained this thought, I knew that what I had seen was real as the blood that pulsed in my veins, as real as the air I struggled to draw into my lungs. The hours crept by in agonizing silence, each moment heavier than the last. By midday, the suffocating dread had twisted itself around my heart, squeezing tighter and tighter with every passing second. I could not shake the sensation that I was not alone. It was as if the very house itself had become alive, watching, waiting. The walls seemed to shift and breathe. The floor creaked beneath the weight of something unseen. My heart raced at the sound, my mind concocting dreadful images of what could be lurking just beyond my sight. I thought of the man, if man he was, who had appeared at my window. His face twisted in that grotesque grin, as though mocking me, as though he knew some terrible truth that I was too blind to see. Who or what was he, and why had he come? The questions plagued me, each one spiraling deeper into the abyss of my mind, where reason gave way to despair. At last, as the sun began its slow descent, casting the world into a crimson glow, I could bear the isolation no longer. I left the house, hoping the outside air would cleanse me of the paranoia that clung to me like a shroud. But even as I stepped into the open, I felt no relief. The sky seemed darker, the shadows longer, as if the world itself was conspiring against me. And then I felt it again, the gaze, that cold, penetrating stare. I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing, only the empty street, the wind rustling through the trees. And yet I knew. He was there, somewhere, watching. The night was coming, and with it, I feared, the return of the horror I could neither name nor escape. The night had descended upon me like a suffocating shroud, thicker and more oppressive than I had ever known. Its darkness was not merely an absence of light, it was something alive, something that pressed against the very walls of my mind, closing in with every passing moment. I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the setting sun would take with it the strange unease that had gripped me since that terrible encounter at the window. But instead, the shadows deepened, and with them, so too did the dread that gnawed relentlessly at my soul. I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, the feeble glow of the lamp casting grotesque shapes upon the walls. Each flicker of the bulb seemed to twist those shadows into unnatural forms, writhing and contorting like tortured souls trapped between this world and the next. My heart pounded in my chest, its rhythm uneven, like the drum of a prisoner awaiting execution. And I, the condemned, felt that the sentence was drawing ever nearer. The house was too quiet. It was the kind of silence that seems to have a sound all its own, a low, humming vibration that filled the air, vibrating against my skin. It was a silence pregnant with anticipation, as though the very house waited, poised for something unspeakable to happen. My senses, sharpened by fear, detected every creak, every shift of the floorboards, each sound magnified 100-fold by my growing paranoia. I could feel my reason slipping, unraveling like a fragile thread caught in the wind. And then it happened. A sound, faint at first but unmistakable. A whisper. Soft, elusive, as though carried on the wings of the night itself. It was distant, barely more than a breath, but it came from inside the house. My skin prickled with cold as I strained to listen, my breath caught in my throat. It was a voice, low, unintelligible, but undeniably there, drifting through the corridors of my mind like a forgotten melody. I rose from the chair, every muscle tensed, my pulse pounding in my ears. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way down the hall, each step deliberate and painfully slow. The house groaned beneath me, as if it too had become a living thing, protesting my intrusion into its hidden depths. The whisper grew louder, but still I could not discern its words, only the eerie cadence that sent shivers cascading down my spine. At the end of the hall stood the door to my bedroom, half open, its dark interior yawning before me like the maw of some ancient slumbering beast. It was from there, I realized, that the sound emanated. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the metal cold against my skin. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking like the groan of a dying man. The room was empty, or so it seemed. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, searching for the source of the whisper. And then, in the reflection of the mirror hanging upon the wall, I saw it. Not clearly, but there, just beyond the reach of sight, a figure, indistinct, standing in the farthest corner of the room. It was a shadow within a shadow, barely visible, but its presence was undeniable. My blood ran cold, my limbs frozen in place as I stared at the reflection, my mind refusing to comprehend the horror of what I saw. The whisper came again, louder now, more distinct, though still beyond my understanding. The figure in the mirror seemed to shift, ever so slightly, as though it were aware of my gaze, as though it, too, watched me. And then, with a sickening realization, I understood. The voice, it was calling my name. My legs gave way beneath me, and I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling with a fear so profound it seemed to tear at the very fabric of my being. The figure remained, unmoving, but I knew, oh I knew, it was waiting. Waiting for me to listen, waiting for me to succumb to its will. The voice, my name, whispered again and again, insidious and unrelenting. I was not alone. And in that moment, as the darkness closed in, I realized with a bone-chilling certainty that I never had been. There are moments in life when reality seems to bend, when the line between what is real and what is imagined dissolves into a twisted, grotesque illusion. I found myself caught in one of these moments where every breath felt thick and heavy, as though the very air had turned to ash, choking the life from my lungs. The figure in the mirror had not moved, nor had the whispers ceased their torturous calling of my name, but something far more sinister had begun to take root. It was not just the shadow in the corner that haunted me now. No, it was something far more insidious, a creeping dread that seemed to pulse from within, as though the horror I had seen had found a way inside me, entwining itself around my heart and mind, squeezing with each agonizing second. I could feel the weight of it, pressing against my chest, a suffocating force that refused to relent. It whispered to me, not just from the corners of the room, but from the dark recesses of my mind, where fear grows like a cancer, unchecked and ravenous. My thoughts were no longer my own, distorted and twisted by the presence that had invaded my life. I began to question everything, my senses, my memories, even my sanity. Had I truly seen the figure in the mirror, or was it a manifestation of my unraveling mind? Was the voice calling my name an echo of some buried guilt? Or was it the murmur of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension, beckoning me into the abyss? These questions gnawed at me, relentless, like teeth scraping against bone. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze from the reflection. The mirror was no longer a simple pane of glass. It had become a gateway, a threshold between worlds. I could feel it drawing me in, pulling at my very soul, as though the reflection had become more real than the room itself. The shadows within it moved, though the figure remained still, its presence suffocating in its silence. My mind drifted to thoughts of death, not the sudden violence of it, but the slow, creeping kind, the kind that wraps itself around you like a fog, suffusing every corner of your existence until all that remains is the hollow echo of your former self. I thought of graves, cold and forgotten, of the weight of the earth pressing down, of the endless, inescapable darkness. Was that what awaited me? Was that what this thing wanted? To pull me down into that void, to bury me in the black depths of my own despair? The whisper came again, low and insistent, wrapping itself around my consciousness like a vine, squeezing tighter with each repetition of my name. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the floor, the impact barely registering through the fog of terror that had consumed me. I lay there, helpless, staring up at the mirror from my place on the ground, as though it were a great eye watching me, mocking my weakness. How long I remained there, paralyzed by my own fear, I cannot say. Time had ceased to have meaning, each moment blending into the next, a seamless stretch of agony. My pulse throbbed in my ears, each beat a reminder of the fragility of life, of how easily it could be extinguished. I wanted to scream, to shout, to banish the thing from my mind, but my voice refused to obey. All I could do was lie there, trapped in my own terror, as the weight of the shadows pressed down upon me. And then, in the stillness, I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. It was not the whisper, not the dreadful murmur of my name. No, this was different. A soft, deliberate tapping, as though fingers were gently rapping against glass. My blood turned to ice as I realized where the sound was coming from. The window. I turned my head, slow and agonizing, toward the source of the noise. Through the darkness, I could just make out the shape of the window, the very one where the nightmare had first begun. And there, pressed against the glass, was the same face. The same twisted grin, the same hollow, staring eyes. But this time the figure was not merely watching, it was beckoning. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat, half a sob, half a scream, as the figure raised a hand and slowly, deliberately traced its fingers along the glass. The sound was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard. A grating, grinding noise that burrowed into my skull. My heart pounded with a force I thought would shatter my ribs, and still I could not move, could not tear my eyes away from the horror that stood before me. The tapping continued, rhythmic, unrelenting, as though it were counting down to some unspeakable event. And in that moment I knew, whatever this thing was, it would not stop. It would not leave. It had come for me, and it would claim me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The night had become an eternity, an endless void through which I wandered, lost and forsaken. There was no respite, no fleeting moments of peace, only the oppressive weight of dread, pressing down upon my chest like the hand of a cruel, invisible god. I had not moved from my place on the floor. I could not. The paralysis of terror had taken hold of my limbs, locking me in a state of helplessness. My mind, too, had betrayed me, spiraling deeper into the abyss with each passing second, dragging me further from reason, from hope. The tapping at the window had ceased, but its echo lingered in the air, as though the very walls had absorbed the sound. The figure, the wretched, grinning thing that had haunted me, had vanished once more into the shadows. Yet I knew it was not gone. It never truly left. It was there, lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for the moment when I would finally surrender to the madness it had planted in my soul. I had begun to wonder if I was already lost, if the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of nightmares had blurred, leaving me stranded in a place where neither light nor reason could reach. The air around me felt heavy, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. I could feel them, watching, always watching. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the dim light seemed to carry with it the presence of something I could not see, but knew was there. I could no longer deny it. This thing, this presence, was not merely a figment of my imagination. It had taken root in the deepest recesses of my mind, where fear braids and festers. It had found a home in the very essence of my being, wrapping itself around my thoughts, my memories, until all that remained was the terror. And it was growing stronger. I thought back to the moments of my life before this nightmare began, memories that now seemed distant, faded, like the remnants of a dream. There had been joy once, fleeting though it was. Laughter, companionship, even love. But now, those moments felt foreign, as though they belonged to someone else. Someone who had not been touched by the cold fingers of the abyss. I wondered if that person still existed somewhere, or if the terror had consumed him entirely, leaving behind only this hollow shell that I had become. I could not remain in this house any longer. The walls, the floors, even the air. It all felt poisoned, tainted by the presence that had invaded my life. Every breath I took seemed to draw me deeper into its clutches, suffocating me with the weight of its darkness. I had to leave. I had to escape before it was too late. But as I rose to my feet, legs trembling beneath me, a new dread washed over me. The figure at the window had returned, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. But now there was something different about it, something far more terrifying than before. It no longer seemed content to merely watch from the shadows. It had taken on a new form, solid, corporeal, as though it had crossed the threshold from the world of nightmares into my reality. It stood there, motionless, its grin widening into a grotesque mockery of humanity. The window pane between us was no longer a barrier. I could feel the chill of its presence seep through the glass, as though it was already inside, already breathing the same air I breathed. I stumbled backward, my body convulsing with terror, but there was no escape. Every corner of the house was filled with the creeping shadow of its influence. Every inch of my mind consumed by the knowledge that it was coming for me. And then, the whispers began again. Soft at first, barely audible, like the rustling of dead leaves in a forgotten graveyard. But they grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, each one murmuring in a language I could not understand, but that I somehow knew. They were speaking to me, calling me, beckoning me to join them in the dark. I pressed my hands to my ears, desperate to shut out the sound, but it was inside me now, reverberating through my bones, my blood, my very soul. The figure in the window raised a hand, its fingers curling in a gesture of invitation. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in place by the sheer weight of my terror. It was then that I understood the truth, the awful, inescapable truth that had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness all along. This thing, this abomination, was not merely a visitor from some distant realm of nightmares. It was me. Or rather, it was the reflection of everything I had tried to bury. Every fear, every sin, every fragment of guilt that had festered and grown in the darkness of my soul. The whispers swelled, drowning out all other sound, as the figure stepped closer, its form twisting and distorting in the dim light. And as it moved, I could feel the walls closing in around me, the shadows growing thicker, more tangible, until there was no escape, no light, no hope. Only the abyss, and I was falling. I no longer knew the passage of time. Hours, minutes, seconds, they had all blurred into one continuous stream of dread, a river that swept me along its currents toward some unspeakable end. I was no longer just a man trapped in the torment of my own home. I was something less, something diminished, an echo of the person I once was. Whatever semblance of self I had clung to had been eroded by the relentless march of fear. The figure at the window had vanished again, but I felt it, ever present, lurking just out of sight. It had woven itself into the very fabric of my being, its cold, shadowy tendrils reaching into the deepest parts of my mind. It wasn't a presence I could flee from, nor could I fight it. It had become me, a part of my thoughts, my fears, my soul. And in that twisted union, I could feel my identity unraveling, thread by thread. As I stood there, hollow and trembling, I realized with a sudden, terrible clarity that the horror I had been running from was not something external. It had never been about the figure at the window, or the haunting whispers that filled the house. Those were mere reflections, distortions of the terror that lay within me. I was the architect of my own nightmare, the creator of the monster that now stalked me. The house groaned, its ancient bones creaking under the weight of a silence that felt alive. Each sound, every shift of the walls, seemed to pulse with malevolence, as though the very structure had absorbed my fear, my madness, and now reveled in it. I could feel the house watching me, its gaze as cold and unrelenting as the figure that had once stood at the window. I stumbled through the rooms, my vision clouded with exhaustion and terror. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing with each step, as if the house itself sought to crush me within its grasp. I could hear the whispers again, growing louder with every passing moment, echoing in my ears like the toll of a funeral bell. They spoke not in words, but in feelings, in dread, in guilt, in the deep, primal fear that had gnawed at my soul for so long. I reached the mirror once more, the cursed mirror that had been the source of it all. It stood before me like a portal to another world, its surface dark and gleaming, reflecting not just my image, but the twisted fragments of my mind. And there in its depths, I saw the figure again, but this time it did not stand apart from me. No, it was me. My face, my eyes staring back at me with a cruel, mocking smile. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat, but it was too late. The figure in the mirror raised a hand, and I felt my own arm move, not of my own will, but as though it had been seized by some invisible force. The reflection's grin widened, and I watched in horror as my hand reached up to my throat, fingers curling with malicious intent. Stop. I tried to scream, but the sound was strangled, trapped in my chest. My reflection's grip tightened, the pressure on my throat increasing, cutting off my air. My vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening as the blood pounded in my ears. I struggled against the unseen force, but it was no use. I was losing control, losing myself. The whispers had reached a fever pitch now, swirling around me like a storm, filling my mind with a cacophony of voices that drowned out all reason. And in the midst of it all, I could hear one voice, clear and distinct, rising above the others. You cannot escape. The words echoed in my mind, sinking deep into my soul. They were right. There was no escape. Not from this house, not from the figure in the mirror, and not from the darkness within me. The terror had always been there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the moment when I would finally succumb to it. And now, that moment had come. As the darkness closed in, I felt a strange sense of peace, a resignation to the fate that had always been mine. I had fought against it for so long, but in the end, the terror had won. It had claimed me, body and soul. The reflection in the mirror smiled one last time, and as my vision faded to black, I realized with a sickening certainty that I had become the very thing I feared. There was no escape, not from the house, not from the whispers, and not from the horror that lived within me. I was lost forever. And in that final, agonizing moment, I understood the truth. I had never been alone. The monster had always been there, hiding in the dark corners of my mind, waiting to take control. And now, it had.